I woke up that morning to the sound of gunfire. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't just a dream. The shots were real, and they were coming from the direction of the main road. My mother, Francie, was already up, standing at the window, her face pale. "Orson, get dressed, quickly," she whispered, her voice trembling. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I pulled on my clothes. The house was silent, except for the distant sounds of chaos outside. We lived in Wiesbaden, a small town in Germany, but it felt like we were in the middle of a war zone. My mother handed me a small duffel bag, already packed with essentials. "Follow me," she said, leading me out of the house and into the cool, early morning air. The street was deserted, but the sound of gunfire grew louder. My mother took my hand, and we ran, ducking behind buildings and fences, trying to stay hidden. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel the fear radiating from her. We finally reached a small alleyway, and my mother stopped to catch her breath. "Stay here," she whispered, her eyes scanning the area. "I need to find out what's going on. I'll be back soon." Before I could protest, she was gone, leaving me alone in the shadows. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. What if something happened to her? What if this was more than just a random incident? I remembered the stories my father, Jean Aberbach, used to tell me about his time with the French resistance. He was brave, and he always knew what to do. But I was just a 14-year-old kid, and I felt helpless. I sat in the alley, trying to listen for any sign of my mother. The sounds of the town were different now, more chaotic. I heard voices shouting and more gunfire. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clutched the duffel bag tighter. After what felt like hours, I saw a figure approaching, my mother. She looked exhausted but relieved to see me. "Come on," she said, grabbing my hand. "We need to get out of here." We ran back to the house, grabbing a few more things and quickly locking the door behind us. My mother led me to a small car, parked a few blocks away. She started the engine and we sped off, the sound of the car drowning out the chaos behind us. As we drove, my mother explained what had happened. "There's a protest and it's turned violent. The army is trying to control the situation, but things are getting out of hand. We need to get to a safer place." I nodded, still trying to process everything. We drove for what seemed like hours, the landscape changing from familiar streets to unfamiliar roads. My mother was calm, but I could tell she was worried. We finally arrived at a small village, and my mother found a quiet place to park. "Stay here," she said. "I'll be right back. I need to find someone who can help us." I watched as she disappeared into the village, her figure growing smaller in the distance. I was alone again, but this time I felt a bit more in control. I thought about the debate team I had just joined at school. We were supposed to debate whether medical services should be free. It seemed so trivial now, compared to what was happening. I leaned back in the seat, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My father's stories came back to me, reminding me of his bravery. I wished he were here to guide me, to tell me what to do. But he was gone, and it was up to me to be strong. I closed my eyes, hoping my mother would return soon. The world outside was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to be brave, just like my father. I was 11 when I saw Elvis Presley on TV for the first time. It was January 1956, and I was staying with my grandma Alice Mary in Camden, South Carolina. Grandma was a widow, and she lived with her dad, Dr. Caleb Whittaker, in a big old house on Littleton Street. The house was worn like most of the houses in Camden, a place with a rich history but a tough present. After the Civil War, Camden had struggled, and even in 1956, you could see the effects of that long economic drought. Grandma Alice had a TV, which was a big deal back then. She was excited to show it off to my mom, Francie, and me. We had just arrived from Wiesbaden, Germany, where my mom worked at a U.S. Army base. When we got to Camden, Grandma hugged us tightly, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about being in a new place. Camden was a horse town, and one of Grandma's friends, Bill Woody, owned a riding stable. He offered to teach me how to ride, and I loved it. I spent hours every day on horseback, dreaming of joining the cavalry when I grew up. But that all changed one night when we watched a TV show. The show was hosted by Jackie Gleason, and he introduced a young singer from Memphis, Tennessee, named Elvis Presley. When Elvis came on, I was blown away. He had this angelic face, a big smile, and hair styled in a pompadour. He started singing I Got a Woman, and I couldn't believe how the music made me feel. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. The beat was hypnotic, and Elvis's energy was infectious. I felt like I was part of something bigger, something that defied all the rules. My mom and grandma were stunned. Grandma even suggested that Elvis should wear a belt around his knees, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I wanted to be like Elvis. After the show, I went to my room and started writing a letter to him. I asked if I could work for him that summer. My mom found me writing and laughed, but she didn't stop me. The next day, I decided to go to Columbia, an hour away, to buy Elvis's music. I had over $30, which seemed like a fortune to me. I took the bus and spent hours in the music store, but they only had one Elvis song, Heartbreak Hotel. I bought it and played it over and over. I told my mom, they'll be listening to this song in 1976, I promise you. Back in Wiesbaden, I was obsessed. I played the record on my mom's player and waited for the new Elvis album to arrive. My mom, who worked at the personnel office on base, ordered it for me from the PX. I couldn't wait to hear more of Elvis's music. At school, I started a fan club with my best friend, Priscilla Beaulieu. We called it the FDR Presley Fan Club, and we collected articles and photos of Elvis. We talked about his songs and his performances, and we even wrote essays about why we loved him. By mid-May, our club had over 20 members, and we were spreading the word about Elvis far and wide. Elvis became more than just a singer to me. He was a symbol of freedom, joy, and rebellion. He made me feel like I could do anything, and I knew that no matter what, I would always be a fan. Orson and I, Priscilla, were huge Elvis fans. We followed every bit of news about him, especially from Corporal Stan Matchlup's column in Stars and Stripes. Matchlup wrote about Elvis's visits to Hollywood and his new movie deal. He even mentioned a near crash landing of Elvis's plane, which scared us to death. Matchlup thought Elvis might become as big as Frank Sinatra. Heartbreak Hotel had sold over 1 million copies, and his album was the best-selling LP ever for RCA. When Elvis performed on The Milton Berle Show again, the FDR fan club asked Captain Laswell to get a movie reel of the performances for the camp. Captain Laswell was frustrated, but also a bit amused. He said, I like Elvis, but I can't make the 37th Division's entertainment program an Elvis Presley World's Fair. He told us the PX already had lots of Elvis records, so we weren't exactly starving for his music. After the meeting, Orson and I walked to the gas station. Orson's bike was always chained up there, under the watchful eye of Herr Hafner. We talked about school and Elvis as usual. I'll call you later, Orson said, and I smiled and waved. Maybe I'll come over after homework before supper, he added. I gave him my big smile and got on the bus. Orson was super smart. He got A's in all his classes, and his teacher, Mr. Simon, even wrote a note saying he would have given him an A+ if the school allowed it. Orson really liked Mr. Simon, who was a history teacher. Mr. Simon had a story of his own. He was drafted into the Wehrmacht at 16, but his mom, Anita, saved him. She told a major that Siegfried wasn't her husband's son, but the son of the school headmaster, who was evangelical, not Jewish. The major changed Siegfried's name on his draft papers, and he was released. Mr. Simon was a survivor, and he taught with passion and depth. When Orson and I went to the museum, Mr. Simon explained the paintings and artists in a way that made us feel like we were living in those times. He was so wise and kind, almost like a saint. At the FDR school, we learned a lot about the founding of the United States and the Bill of Rights. Mr. Simon traced the history back to religious persecutions in Europe and how the colonies fought for freedom. We read about the Declaration of Independence and compared it to the constitutional practices in Great Britain and the struggles in France. Mr. Simon made history come alive, and we could see why the French people revolted against the ruling class. The FDR school was set up right after the war. It was a military-sponsored school, in a building that used to be a German army hospital. Major Bruno Brennan, who was actually called Major by everyone, was the principal. He was a Cornell grad and spoke German fluently. He hired Mr. Simon, who was a natural teacher, to replace someone who was moving to America. Orson and I were lucky to have Mr. Simon as our teacher. He made us think deeply about the world and our place in it. Orson and I were just kids, but we knew we were part of something bigger. We had each other, our love for Elvis, and the lessons we learned from Mr. Simon. Life in Wiesbaden wasn't always easy, but it was full of moments that made us feel connected and hopeful. I knew the area around camp, Pershing like the back of my hand. If I was blindfolded at the gate, I could walk to the PX without a problem. I'd paced it out, 120 steps to Barracks 16, 80 more to Barracks 14, and so on until I reached Barracks 2. Then I'd navigate the string of hangars, each 52 yards long, and the 16 yards of grass and road between them. Finally, I'd turn southeast, avoid the chapel, and there I'd be at the PX. I'd seen the shortages in post, war Germany firsthand. My mom and I hadn't suffered much because she could buy things at the PX that were hard to find elsewhere. Watches, champagne, comic books, and Elvis records were all there. I made a detailed plan to get into the PX. If it was summer, I could slide under the building easily, but it was winter and the ground was frozen. I'd have to crawl under the building and use a trapdoor near the heating fuel. I borrowed a drill, a flashlight, and other tools from my friend Andy. The PX closed at 8 p.m., so I went to the camp library to wait. The librarian, Sergeant Angela Humphreys, noticed I was reading more than usual. "My Orson, you read more than anyone in the camp," she said. I just smiled and said I had a lot to catch up on. At 8:45, I left the library and biked to the PX. I circled it twice to make sure no one was around. I parked my bike at the chapel and crawled under the building. It was freezing, but I took off my jacket to avoid getting stuck. I found the trapdoor and started drilling a hole near the hinges. The cold made my hands shake, and the dirt got under my clothes, but I kept drilling. Finally, I broke through the plank and reached the bolt. I pushed open the trapdoor and sat up, wiping the sweat and dirt from my eyes. Now I could walk to the record counter and grab the Elvis records. I'd take 20 copies of the Golden Records compilation and slip them through the trapdoor. I'd put them in my sack and walk out like nothing happened. I grabbed 10 records under each arm and made my way to the trapdoor. But just as I was about to slide them through, the lights flashed on. I had to close my eyes against the glare. When I opened them, I saw 4 MP with their guns pointed at me. "I'll be damned, it's a kid. What you got there, boy?" the lieutenant said. He reached for the records, but then he paused. "Ellis, quick, take your shot." The camera flashed. "That's what you call getting caught with your pants down." The MP put the records on the counter and noticed they were all copies of Elvis's album. He thought about being lenient, but decided I needed a lesson. "Put the cuffs on him," he said. They led me to the guard office. It was just after 10 o'clock. The next morning, my mom got a call from General Hoffritz. She worked for him, and he was my mom's friend. "Your son is here, and he is okay," he said. But then he told her I was in the guardhouse. He broke into the PX. The alarm went off, and the MP caught him. "We can't turn him over to the German police because he's a civilian. We'll do a summary court-martial, but I can't be involved because of our connection. Be here at 8:45 for the hearing." My mom was worried but grateful. She drove to the camp and went to the guardhouse. A corporal was at the desk reading a magazine. "Ma'am, these aren't visiting hours," he said, but she explained who she was and he let her in. I was in a cell, thinking about what had happened. I'd wanted to share something I loved with others who couldn't afford it, but now I was in trouble. My mom came in, and I could see the worry in her eyes. She hugged me, and I knew I had to explain why I did it. But for now, I just held her tight, wishing I could turn back time. I knew what was coming when the corporal, a black man only a few years older than me, handed me the envelope from my mom. She was Mrs. Killer, the chief of personnel at Camp Pershing. I could see her warm smile as I read the single line inside. "I'll be there tomorrow. With love always, Mum." The next day, a Friday, I was finally free. The major had given me a stern lecture and handed down my sentence. I was to serve 30 days confinement and was released on probation to my mom. The newspaper, Stars and Stripes, had already printed the story about my little adventure at the PX. I was in the headlines, and it wasn't exactly a good look. The article talked about how I broke into the PX and tried to steal 20 copies of Elvis Presley's Golden Records. When the military police caught me, I was holding 10 under each arm. I remember the major asking me why I did it. I told him I wanted to give the records to people who didn't have them. I argued that music, like the air and the water, should be free. The major didn't agree, and he gave me a harsh sentence. He even banned me from listening to Elvis for a month. I was shocked but tried to keep my cool. Mom read the article and laughed over the phone with her mom. But when she sat me down in the kitchen, she wasn't laughing. She told me that if everyone felt they could just take things, the world would fall apart. I felt terrible for hurting her and causing such a commotion, but there was more to it. I believed that my actions were part of a bigger cause, even if I couldn't explain it to her. I promised her I was sorry, but I knew she could see through me. The next morning, I had to face the music at school. The principal, Major Brennan, didn't even let me sit down. He told me I was on probation for the rest of the winter term. He said he hoped I was coming to my senses. I nodded and tried to look contrite, but inside, I was thinking about Mr. Simon, my mentor. I wanted to talk to him about what happened, but I was afraid he would be disappointed. After boxing practice, I went to Mr. Simon's office. He was correcting papers when I walked in. I told him I hadn't told anyone about our talks, not even the judge advocate or the press guy. I thought he would be proud of me, but he wasn't. He said it would have been okay if I told them about his ideas, but he never urged me to steal anything. He called what I did infantile behavior and said it wasn't the right way to change things. I felt small and misunderstood. On Saturday afternoon, something unexpected happened. A white BMW pulled up outside our house, and a private in uniform rang the doorbell. When Mom opened the door, the private smiled and said, "I'm Elvis Presley. I've come to sing to Orson." Mom was shocked, and I was frozen in my chair, playing solitaire. Elvis and his buddy Charlie Hodge came in, and Elvis started playing his guitar. It was the most magical 2 hours of my life. Elvis sang for me, and I was in the same room with him, the world's most famous singer. Charlie explained that Elvis had read the story in the newspaper and decided to visit me. He called Colonel Parker, his manager, to get permission. Colonel Parker was surprised but gave the okay. Elvis was upset about the major banning me from listening to his music and thought it was unconstitutional. He said it was like not allowing me to read a book. Elvis sang me a new song he was working on, and I was amazed. He invited me to visit him at his house in Bad Nauheim. I was so excited that I ran to get my friend Priscilla. When she met Elvis, she was overwhelmed. Elvis said she was the most beautiful girl in the world, and she was in tears. After that, Elvis and I became friends. He called me on the phone, and we talked about music and life. He even wanted to be friends with Priscilla, but I had to explain that she was just my best friend. Elvis laughed and said he understood. He even sang a little song about being a private in the army. It was all so surreal, but I was grateful for every moment. Elvis laughed and told me, "Well, maybe you'll want to experiment when you get 6 weeks older, but before that happens, I want you and Priscilla to come over for dinner at my place. I got a nice big rented house, and I come back to it every night after my army duty. Nobody bothers me, though sometimes there's a photographer hanging around, but my people are careful not to give out my address. I told you I'd have Charlie, you know. Charlie's a pretty good musician on his own. He writes songs, and every now and then I try out one of his songs. I said I'd have Charlie give you my address, but I'll give it to you myself. Dad." He yelled for his dad. "Remind me, what's our address? I mean, we've lived here 9 months, but I'm always forgetting those German spellings." He called out, 14 Go the Stress, want me to spell that. I told him no need. "Okay, what I'm proposing is you and Priscilla come here for dinner on Friday night. I'll send a car for you. I don't want your mom to worry about anything. I'll have you picked up at 5:30. I didn't know what to say. I tried to act cool about being invited to dinner with the most famous person in the world. Maybe except for Winston Churchill and President Eisenhower. Can I bring anything along you'd like? My mom makes great lemon meringue pies." Elvis hesitated. "Sure, tell your mom we'd be happy to have one of her lemon meringue pies. Unless she's given out so many to the court-martial people, she's just plain tired of baking them." I told him my mom would never be too tired to make a pie for Elvis Presley. It was an amazing evening. I found out from the driver, Erhard, that he was a regular driver for Elvis. I sat in the front seat next to Erhard, and Priscilla was in the back. I started asking questions. When I thought I was going too far, I'd talk to Priscilla in English. Erhard didn't know any English. Do you think it's okay if I ask him how many people stay at Elvis's place? Priscilla said, no, but you can ask him how many people Elvis usually has for dinner on Friday nights. That would be okay. I tried the question, and Erhard answered. Sometimes only 4 or 5, he said. Sometimes 10 or 15. He likes to give his guests Southern cooking, especially when it's Germans he invites. But he doesn't like to have them unless they speak English. He doesn't even try to speak our language. Why is your German so good? I've been at school here for 9 years. Ah, I understand. And you, Miss Priscilla? Priscilla had no problem in German. I've been here the same time. Erhard, who looked 30 or 35, said he was going to try to learn English. He and his wife were going to study it together. Elvis had said he would pay if they would learn from the sergeant in his platoon, who gave English lessons on weekends. Mr. Presley said he didn't mind if I used his car to go to where the sergeant teaches. Priscilla spoke in English. Do you think, Orson, I could ask him if he was in the war? Priscilla, I said impatiently. Of course he was in the war. Everybody in Germany was in the war. Mr. Simon was in the war, you know, and he was wounded. That's probably why he's alive. You know a lot about Mr. Simon. What do you do? All those times you go to see him in his study. We talk about world affairs, I said sniffily. Like what's going to happen when Khrushchev travels to America to meet with President Eisenhower. And what they'll do about unemployment and inflation in America. That kind of thing. I felt bad excluding Erhard from the conversation by speaking English to Priscilla. I turned to face the driver. Erhard, when you were in the war, were you captured? Or were you in one of those divisions that surrendered? Erhard snapped. I was a prisoner of war from January 1945. I wondered if Erhard and my dad had once shot at each other. We slowed down as we approached Goethestrasse, with its big buildings still needing repair. The house at the corner was number 14, stucco, solid, plain, dirty white. A man in plain clothes looked out from in front of the garage. The day was warm and his tie was loose. He nodded at Erhard and motioned him to drive in. Then Erhard jumped out of the driver's seat and opened the rear door for Priscilla, who got out and when I came around to join her, extended her hand. I took it, and together we approached the front door. In May, Elvis asked his dad, Vernon, to invite Orson and Priscilla to Paris. Better chance they'd say yes to you than to me, right, Dad? Vernon Presley was remarried after his wife Gladys died. He now lived in a corner of Elvis's house in Bad Nauheim, handling Elvis's personal finances, entering the royalties paid every month and writing checks for his son's expenses. Vernon agreed to do what Elvis asked. Elvis had decided on a trip to Paris during his 5-day furlough. It would be a fun trip with Charlie, Joe, and Lamar, and he wanted Orson and Priscilla to come along. Orson knew Paris well, but Priscilla hadn't been there. Tell the captain, Elvis meant Captain Beaulieu, Priscilla's stepfather, that she'll be very well looked after. We had visited Elvis's home in Bad Nauheim and my place in Wiesbaden, a lot in the past 4 months. Elvis talked a lot with his friends, the Memphis Mafia, about Priscilla and how beautiful she was. You watch, Dad, Elvis joked. One day I will marry Priscilla Ann Beaulieu, but I wouldn't touch her before that, never, not for 100 gold records, not for an Oscar award. The answer from Mrs. Beaulieu to the suggestion that Priscilla go to Paris with Elvis was delivered in her living room to Mr. Vernon Presley, with Captain Beaulieu there, carrying wood for the fireplace. Excuse me, Mr. Presley, but is your son crazy? I don't mean that. Insultingly. Priscilla is 15 years old. That idea was abandoned. But Elvis still wanted Orson to come, even if he came alone. The approach to my mom, Mrs. Francie Killer, was different. Vernon Presley said, Elvis needs someone he can trust and who knows French to help him get around. Sure, Paris will be looking out for Elvis, and he's got bodyguards and his pals, but he really would like Orson along. He thinks the whole world of your son. Mom wasn't entirely surprised. She liked Elvis and had seen my friendship with him grow. She knew she couldn't just say no. She told Vernon she would think about it, but doubted it was the right thing to do. Elvis had visited Wiesbaden several times, and Orson and Priscilla had been to 14 Goethestrasse 3 times. My mom had almost been to Elvis's house. Just 2 weeks before, she and Ann Beaulieu had dropped us off at Goethestrasse at 6. They had dinner and went to the movie theater to see Some Like It Hot. They were back at 10 to pick us up. The plainclothesman outside motioned them to stop, and Elvis came out to shake hands with both ladies, inviting them to come in. Mom declined, saying it was too late. That amused me, Mom being worried about the lateness of the hour for Elvis. But I didn't want to bring up Elvis's hours with her. Anne Beaulieu drove fast on the Autobahn. I was amazed by it all. I tried to sing one of Elvis's new songs but gave up. You try it, Pris, I'll give you the beat. Priscilla sang Willow Weep for me. She got the title right, but couldn't remember the lyrics. So she just hummed the melody, and I clapped my hands to the beat. I laughed. Elvis's accompanists did better than I did. The two guys who play in the army band were there tonight. Corporal George something or other, and Warrant Officer Elmley, Priscilla corrected. Whatever, he's a hell of a drummer. I practiced a drummer's exercise on my mom's head until she brushed my fingers away. I moved them to Priscilla's head. Did you have a nice dinner? Mom asked. Oh yes. Priscilla counted out the food on her fingers. There was biscuits, corn, fried chicken, beans, yams, bacon, jam, jelly, apple pie, and peanut brittle ice cream. What a feast. What did you drink? Mom asked. Well, the guys had beer, but Elvis you're calling him. Mom, you know that, from way back. I couldn't remember when I hadn't known Elvis. No way you could call him Mr. Presley. Not except for that first time. The car stopped. Mom and I stepped out. I squeezed Priscilla's hand before closing the car door. What would my dad, Jean-Jacques Killer, have thought of it all? 5 days in Paris without buses and subways and waiting in line. I wavered for a moment. Then I shook my head. The trip was out of the question. Orson was too young, no matter how smart and well-read he was. But I had one thing working in my favor. Mr. Simon had scheduled his annual history and art trip to Munich, and I had signed up. I walked to my desk and opened my calendar. Praise the Lord, the 2 trips were on the same day. That would make life easier for me. I found out about the invitation when Vernon reported discouragement after visiting Mom. Elvis called Charlie. You tell Orson, Charlie. Figure out a way to get him to go. Charlie and I were good friends now. Elvis had started relaying his invitations through Charlie. Charlie arrived at school, bringing his own sandwich to share with me at lunch. Charlie reported on Elvis's invitation for June 16th, and Vernon's unsuccessful visit to the ladies, Mrs. Killer and Mrs. Beaulieu. What did my mom say? I asked, excited. Vernon said she didn't say much. All she said was that you were only 15 years old. Is that all? She didn't just say no. I'm afraid, Orson, that's what Elvis's dad makes out of it. It was more than just no from the Beaulieus. Captain Beaulieu almost went to the closet for a shotgun. Thanks, Charlie. My mind was racing. You'll hear from me. I had to talk to Mr. Simon. At 4 that afternoon, I knocked on his door, sat down, and got to the point. Mr. Simon, you've heard about my friendship with Elvis. Yes, I think everybody has heard of it. Well, what he did, coming to my house and singing for me, that was a stunt. But what people don't know is that Elvis and I are friends now. He comes over to my house, and he likes Priscilla a lot. He's asked me to be his guide in Paris, to translate for him and stuff. Mr. Simon nodded and tilted his head, to shield his eyes from the sun. That sounds interesting. Orson, what do you want to talk about? You know I'll be glad to talk with you about any concerns. I flushed and looked down at the desk. There are 2 problems, Mr. Simon. One is that Elvis is leaving on the same day we're booked to go to Munich. And the second problem, my mom isn't going to let me go. The first problem is easy. Munich is 700 years old and has seen a lot of war. It will be there when you want to see it next. I was grateful. Thanks, but I want to see it with you. Perhaps that can be arranged. Munich is not far. Now, on the second matter, it's up to you to persuade your mom that a trip to Paris with the most famous musician would be a unique experience. What if she says no? Mr. Simon stroked his scarred eye. Tell her you're either going to go with Elvis to Paris, or you are going to Paris on your own and connect up with Mr. Presley. I stared at him in disbelief. Look, Orson, you are only 15, but you are more advanced than most 17-year-olds. In this world, you can't tell other people what to do unless you are a dictator. Or a court-martial judge. Mr. Simon smiled. Sure, there are lines of authority, but there is even biblical authority for taking control when the time has come over your own life. Mr. Simon paused. I know you, and I trust you not to repeat what I've said. I wouldn't give the same advice to any other boy your age. Now run along, I have work to do." I got up from my chair and paused, lowering my head a bit. My eyes, behind the tight tortoiseshell glasses, were wide with gratitude. Mom came back from work, and I could tell she was worried about the Paris trip. She put off talking to me about it when I arrived on my bike. She knew the invitation had come directly to me. Priscilla told her mom, and her mom called Mom at work. I went straight to my room, only stopping to say hi and give her a quick kiss. After making dinner, Mom decided to talk to me. "Why is this trip so important to you, darling?" I talked slowly but didn't turn to look at her. Since January, I've felt like Elvis only brought me along because of Priscilla. When Captain Bull you said no to Priscilla going, and Elvis still wanted me to come, that was really important to me. My voice shook a bit. For a while, I thought Priscilla wasn't interested in me anymore, just in Elvis. And I thought Elvis only liked me because of Priscilla. But now I know Elvis is really my friend, and I'm not just the guy who brings Priscilla along. That's why I can't say no, Mom. Mom said she understood and went back to the kitchen to stir the soup. A few minutes later, she told me I could go. I hugged her and I was so excited that I couldn't sleep until after midnight. The next day, I stood outside the waiting room at the railroad station in Friedberg. Charlie Hodge had told me our train would leave at 2:13. I left my bus just after 1:30, carrying my navy blue sea bag, which used to be my dad's. At 1:45, I saw a policeman come by and stand on the platform. A woman's voice came over the speakers, announcing train arrivals. The 1337 to Stuttgart via Frankfurt and Mannheim is coming in on track 3. The 1342 to Hanover via Göttingen is next on track 4. A police car drove up and parked under a big oak tree. The policeman started to keep cars away from the main part of the platform. I moved to the other end of the platform. I heard a woman protesting, "But officer, I always meet my husband here. He's on the early shift and comes in on the 14:2. The policeman muttered, "Security," and motioned her to the parking lot. Then another policeman came over to me. "Where are you going, young man?" "I'm going on the 14:13, officer." "You'll have to wait over there." He pointed to the far end of the platform. "This area is reserved." Then the crowd started to grow. Mostly teenage girls, but some boys too. One guy leaned against the tree and held up his radio, turning up the volume. He started chanting, "Elvis, Elvis." Soon, everyone joined in, and the crowd grew bigger. The police put up a rope to separate the eastern side of the station. It was 2, and the crowd turned toward the station, getting closer to the policemen. They were shouting, "Elvis is coming, Elvis is coming." 3 cars pulled up slowly. The first had 4 men in plain clothes. They showed their badges to the security policemen. The first car moved to the platform, and the second car pulled up next to it. The third car backed up at a right angle blocking access. The shouts got louder. I could see a window in the back seat of the second car being lowered. At 2:05, the car door opened. It was Elvis. He looked sharp, his sideburns gone, his uniform pressed, and his jacket tailored with a new corporal's chevron. The crowd went wild. Elvis walked to the cordon and started shaking hands. The police kept the barrier firm. The train whistled. Elvis raised both hands, saluting with a big smile. He tried a few words in German, "Vielen Dank," and "Thank you very much, my beloved friends." He backed up to the train, and the doors opened. 4 men carried Elvis's bags. A conductor pointed to the reserved rear car. I tried to break through, but the cordon was too strong. I shouted, "Elvis, Charlie, Lamar, Joe, it's me, Orson." Joe Esposito saw me, talked to the policeman, and the cordon was lifted. I rushed over, sea bag in hand, and climbed into the private car. I had never been in a private train compartment before. There were 8 of us, and each compartment was the same size. The first 2 were for Elvis. Then came Lamar Fike, Charlie Hodge, and Joe Esposito. At the back were 2 saloons. One had a bar, and the other had a big window with a view of the springtime landscape. There was even a piano. Elvis opened an envelope from the colonel with a note. "You'll be met, of course. Thought you'd enjoy the piano. Cook me up a couple of new songs. Ers Tom." Elvis was overjoyed. He sat down and started playing Mystery Train. Charlie brought out a bottle of scotch and used 2 ballpoint pens to keep rhythm. Elvis sang at the top of his lungs. There was applause, and I joined in. Elvis beamed as if he was performing at the Ryman Auditorium. He bowed his head and turned it side to side. "Thank you, thank you." He sat down again and sang Hound Dog. The applause was routine now. Elvis asked Lamar to get his guitar for the next song. It went on like that for a while. The porter took drink orders. Elvis got a beer, and I asked for a Coke. When it was time to eat, we put on some records. The Colonel had sent a full collection of Elvis's albums, including the new Elvis's Golden Records Volume 2. We talked about Paris. Poontang City, Joe said with a grin. "Say that in French, Joe," Lamar challenged. "Ask Orson how to say it." Everyone looked at me, sitting with my Coke. I blushed and stammered. Elvis rescued me. "I'm gonna see all the sights in Paris, not just the kind of thing you guys are thinking about. And I've got a private guide who speaks French as well as English. Right, Orson? Let's have a drink to the first person a military judge told he couldn't listen to Elvis records." "Capital punishment," Lamar said, raising his glass of bourbon and ginger ale. "Elvis called me killer. You don't sing, do you, killer?" "I can't really hit the notes. Priscilla, she's very good. She's working on some German songs called Lieder. Maybe I'll train you. You'll be able to say you had the most expensive music teacher in the world. Now, sing after me. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Come on, Orson. Give him a hand, guys." I closed my eyes and raised my hands to my collar, trying to find my voice. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Elvis's face lit up. He held up one hand to quiet the others and encouraged me with the other. "How I wonder what you are." Everyone clapped, and I opened my eyes. I asked Elvis if I could have a beer. "First beer," Elvis asked, raising his eyebrows. "Yes, sir. Just yes is good enough." He motioned to the porter, and I got a tall, foaming glass of Jever. Elvis raised his guitar and sang, "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," in his own style. We all applauded, and I wondered if I had ever been so happy. When we arrived in Paris, Jean Aberbach, the French producer of Elvis's records, met us at the station. He took us to the top floor suite at the Prince de Galles Hotel, where we had a view of the whole city. Jean said he hadn't planned a schedule, because it was a vacation trip. Elvis said he wanted to see historical Paris, but also the nightlife. "Orson can take care of my daytime education, right, Orson?" We went to a sidewalk cafe for coffee. Elvis kept his uniform on, which helped him stay anonymous. Orson ordered for us. A girl came over with her school pad and asked for an autograph. Elvis never said no to a request for an autograph or a handshake. A line started to form. Elvis told Joe and Lamar to stay, and Orson and I went back to the hotel. Back in the suite, Elvis ordered lunch and asked me to show him Paris from the car. We went to the Quai d'Orsay and the Tuileries. "It's prettier than our own capital," Elvis said. Then we went to the Eiffel Tower. "Maybe I can go up it at night." "No," I told him, "the elevator doesn't go past the second floor after 5. We drove out to Versailles. Elvis was amazed by the palace and the gardens. We headed back to Paris around 6. Elvis was tired from the day, so we went back to the hotel. Charlie and Lamar were reading magazines, and Joe was sleeping. Elvis said he would nap and went to the presidential room. I was given a small room for aid. I called Mom and tried to tell her about the last 24 hours. I promised to visit my dad's grave at Père Lachaise and pray for him and Mom. I promised to call again if I had time. I lay down and fell asleep. 2 hours later, Elvis came out. Jean Aberbach and the others were waiting. Elvis was worried about Orson going out with us. "He's only 15. Do they let minors go to the places we're going to tonight, Jean?" "They let them in if they're with you," Jean winked. Elvis was concerned. "I don't want to do anything wrong with Orson." "Come on, he's almost 16. It's time for him to get laid. Besides, he's good looking, they'll line up for him." Elvis was angry. "We're not heading out for a whorehouse, Lamar. Jean, what do you have planned for us?" Jean said we would go to the Foley's Berger first. "It's great entertainment. Beautiful girls, great food and wine, great music." "Then what?" Jean smiled. "Then we'll see." The days after the Paris trip were a whirlwind. I felt different, older maybe. Elvis was different too. He started calling me late at night, just to chat. I could tell he was lonely, and I felt honored that he wanted to talk to me. He mentioned Priscilla a lot, how he wanted her to visit more often. I knew Mrs. Beaulieu was still hesitant, so I told Elvis he should talk to her directly. He agreed and asked me to put in a good word. I did, and surprisingly, Captain Bowl, you eventually said yes. Priscilla started visiting Go the Stress more, and I was happy for them. I found myself thinking about Paris a lot. That trip had changed me in ways I couldn't quite explain. I didn't talk about it much, not even with my mom. But I did talk to Mr. Simon. He had become more than just a teacher to me. He was a friend and a confidant. I visited him often, and we talked about everything from world events to personal stuff. One day I decided to tell him about Paris. I told him about the nightlife, about the girls, and about my first time. Mr. Simon listened without judgment, just like he always did. He said it was part of being human, and that there was nothing to be ashamed of. It made me feel a bit better, but also a bit more curious about the world. Mr. Simon invited me to his apartment for dinner. I was excited but also a bit nervous. I told my mom, and she was firm. No, Orson, you are not to visit Mr. Simon after hours. That's my final word. I was taken aback. I hadn't expected her to react so strongly. I didn't argue, though. I just nodded and went to my room, feeling a mix of disappointment and confusion. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about all the changes in my life. Elvis, Priscilla, Mr. Simon. They were all important to me, but they were also pulling me in different directions. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I knew one thing for sure. I was growing up, and the world was a lot bigger and more complicated than I had ever imagined. I closed my eyes and let the thoughts drift away, wondering what the future held.